Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the scenes of hundreds of thousands of desperate migrants that fill our TV screens provide powerful images for those arguing that we should turn our backs on the crisis-hit European Union. And in a moment, I'll be asking UKIP's only MP, Douglas Carswell, about those arguments. But first, let's have a look at what Leave campaigners have been up to this week.
They need a free trade deal with us, and it will be a central part of the negotiations when we leave the European Union, an important part, but one where they have a commercial imperative to do a deal.
Once we have control of our own borders, we can send back whoever we want. So if somebody comes here and they're not appropriate, they shouldn't be here, they should have stopped in France or Germany, wherever, we'll send them back. So the threat is both wrong, inappropriate, and won't work.
Come on, donnez-moi un break, as we say in Brussels. Donnez-moi un break.
It's sad, but perhaps unsurprising, that those who want the British people to be kept in the European Union have launched what they call Project Fear. This is designed to make the British people afraid of change.
And the UKIP MP, Douglas Carswell, joins me now. Welcome to the programme. Let's look at some of the things your side has been complaining. First of all, the cost of membership. That you've said, Vote Leave has said, we'll stop sending £350 million every week to Brussels. Do you stand by that figure of £350 million?
Absolutely, and the reason I do, Andrew, is because every year we make a gross contribution of 19.2 billion. Now, if you divide 19.2 billion by the number of weeks there are in a year, it's 350. And we've also been very clear, we're talking about what we send to Brussels.
Okay, well, let's look at that. Let's just look a little more detail here, because this is from the Office of Budget Responsibility. We'll stick with the 2014 figures. There it is up there. Now, as you said, the table on the left-hand side, the column there, we've got 18.3 billion. That's what the
It's actually 19.2 now.
Right. Let's
I'll
stick
let
with
that
this. 18.3 gives you the 350 million. But before we send that, we deduct the rebate of almost 5 billion. We don't send the rebate.
Well, I think
we don't send. No, the government has told us that we don't send the rebate. We take the 5 billion off. So the contribution we send is 13.5 billion, and that is 260 million a week.
Let me tell you why I think it's entirely right and fair we include the rebate. The rebate figure is very, very vulnerable to the whims and machinations of ministers and mandarins. Look at what Tony Blair did.
But we don't send the rebate.
Look at what Tony Blair did with the rebate. They can play fast and loose with it at the blink of an eye. It's entirely right and proper that we include
what
the
I'm
rebate
trying to point out is because the phrase here was sending 350 million. We don't send the rebate and they send it back.
That rebate
we take the rebate off and then we send them 13.5.
That rebate is very vulnerable. As we discovered when Tony Blair gave away a large section of the rebate is money on the table that is very vulnerable to change. I think it's entirely fair that we include that figure there.
But we don't send it. And then, in addition to that, having not sent the rebate but actually sent 13.5, we then get 4.4, almost 4.5 billion back to spend in ways that will be guided, sometimes dictated by the EU, but it is money that comes back. So our net contribution, as you can see from that table there, is 9 billion, which is 175 million a week. It is not 350 million.
The reason why I think
week.
it's fair for us to talk about the gross contribution of 19.2 billion a year is because when you pay your tax, Andrew, you don't deduct from that the services you get back from the government. You don't say that your overall tax bill is zero because of all the services and the mended potholes and the fixed street lights and all the other things you get. It's entirely right and proper that we talk about the 19.2 billion that we send over every year to Brussels.
But I've just explained that we don't send that. And the net contribution, the actual saving, because the original quote was about saving to spend elsewhere, is 175 million a week. Now, you can say that's too much, it's not enough, I don't want to stay in, that's fine. But it's not 350 million a week.
350 million on the table, highly vulnerable. Some of that is because it's part of the rebate. I think it's entirely right and proper that we talk about that. That is enough money every week to build a new hospital.
And of course, it wouldn't be a saving, would it? Because even out of the EU, we would continue to have some form of farm subsidies and some forms of regional aid, wouldn't we?
We would spend some of that money that we currently send to Brussels for ourselves. Of course we would. I personally think that instead of sending 350 million a week to Brussels, we would be better off spending some of that money improving the NHS, giving a better deal to some of our farmers, absolutely, maybe even some tax cuts. But I think it's entirely fair that we talk about 350 million that we're having to send every week to Brussels.
People will make their minds up on that. Let's move on to another issue really related to sovereignty now. Nigel Farage has said that 75% of UK law is made in Brussels. Do you agree with that?
Well, I asked the parliamentary authorities when I first became an MP, and they weren't able to tell me. There's some dispute. Some people in the other side claim it's as little as 15%. On our side, some people claim 70%. I looked at a question that was asked by in the German legislature in Berlin, and they got a figure of some 80%. So it depends on how you look at it.
We're talking about the UK
very
here.
significant.
Do you agree with the 75% figure?
I think that's probably about right.
What's the source?
There are a number of different sources. The German legislature has produced
No, I'm
some
talking
data.
about the UK. What's the source for the UK?
The question was talking about the amount of legislation that is emanating from member states versus that's coming from Brussels.
But what is the source of the 75% figure?
Well, you just cited Nigel. There are a whole variety of different sources.
He's not a source, he's a messenger.
Well,
you see, I mean, we've looked there has been a lot of research done on this, and we've looked quite carefully at it.
Yeah, I've asked questions in Parliament and never got a straight
We can
answer.
find no credible study, even by pro-Brexit groups, that puts the figure at 75%. I've seen studies that show 25% of primary legislation, 13% of statutory instruments, EU related, but I can find nothing that gives me 75%. And I don't think this morning you can help on that.
Well, I've raised questions in Parliament, and I'm happy to forward on the answers that I've given, that I've got. But there is an answer to a question raised.
75%.
Well, the German Parliament has produced a figure of 80-something%.
Right.
I'm happy to share that
for the German Parliament.
Well, talking about the ratio of legislation that comes from member states versus that emanating from Brussels, I think it's a fair point to make.
Let's move on to migration, because Vote Leave says if we vote Leave, we can take back control of our immigration policy. Now, no country has full access to the single market without first agreeing to the free movement of peoples. We'd have to do the same, wouldn't we?
Well, I don't think we should necessarily commit ourselves to being in the single market. We want access to the single market. Now, we know, as you brilliantly demonstrated earlier this week when you quizzed Matthew Hancock, you can have tariff-free trade from Iceland to Ireland to Russia. In fact, I think only Belarus doesn't have tariff-free access. So we could leave the EU and have tariff-free access. Now, Canada, who are not in the EU, have recently negotiated a deal to give them full market access without labour mobility.
The Canadian deal includes tariffs, does not even
but not
tariffs,
labour mobility.
Even tariffs on some manufactured products. It includes tariffs on agricultural products, and it also does not include anything to do with services.
But we are
80% a service economy.
But we would benefit, as every country in Europe, apart from Belarus does, from tariff-free access. Tariff-free access that stretches from Iceland through to Russia. And we would remain part of that tariff-free access.
But how do you know that? The Council of the European Union is unequivocal. 2 years ago, the internal market and its four freedoms, one of which is freedom of movement, are indivisible. You can't have one without the other.
We know that last year we had a trade deficit with the other EU member states of about 60 billion. The idea that they would somehow impose tariffs from cross-channel trade from which they're the principal beneficiaries seems to me absurd. On the point of regulation, sometimes it's said that we need to be part of the single market for regulatory reasons, but increasingly we live in a world of globalized markets. We're seeing this global regulatory convergence that in many ways is making the EU redundant. I think it's perfectly possible for us to have market access from a regulatory perspective without being part of the single market.
Though, if you're selling into Europe, you have to meet Europe's regulations.
And many of those regulations are now set at an international standard.
Exactly.
Basel III, many of the food standards
America,
regulations.
you have to do that.
Yeah.
But do I take it that you're indicating that if we leave, we would not seek total access to the single market, as we have at the moment. We would seek instead a free trade agreement, which is less than a single market.
We would seek access to the single market, but we wouldn't want to be bound up and regulated by the single market.
So we wouldn't seek full access. We would not initially seek full access to the single market.
I think if we had tariff-free access and if we didn't have regulatory obstacles put in our way, it would be free access. But we wouldn't seek to be part of the single market. But
the free trade agreements that you've specified, particularly the one with Canada, as I say, it's not a single market agreement. It includes tariffs. It includes. It does not include services.
We'll look at a couple of countries closer to home. Take, for example, Switzerland, for example. Now, Switzerland at the moment has 4.5 times more trade per head with the EU from outside the single market than we manage from within. So, by definition, Andrew, it must be possible to get a better deal than we have today.
And it does not have full single market access for its services.
But they do a lot better in terms of trading with the EU than we do from within.
But it doesn't. You accept that a free trade agreement...
They do 4.5 times more trade per capita outside than we manage from within.
But they've also moved huge chunks of their main banks, their financial services, to London so that they're inside the EU and
another
can trade.
vote of confidence in the City of London.
All right. Just within UKIP itself, on Friday, Suzanne Evans and Peter Reeve, your fellow Vote Leave supporters, they were sacked from their roles as UKIP speakers. Miss Evans has now been sacked twice in her official role. Are you next for the job?
Suzanne Evans is magnificent. She's so brilliant. She's brilliant at this sort of stuff. You should have her on the show more often. We're going to hear a lot more from Suzanne Evans.
Are you next for the chop?
Look, Nigel described me as irrelevant.
Sad?
I've been called far worse in the 5 parliamentary elections where I've stood. But the point is, in 4 of those 5 parliamentary elections, I won. Now, that's the beauty of democracy, isn't it? It's the people who decide who is.
But is being a Vote Leave supporter, as you are, and a member of UKIP, and you're a UKIP MP, are these two things now becoming mutually exclusive?
Absolutely not. 4 out of every 5 UKIP councillors across the country is now signed up to Vote Leave. Vote Leave is now garnering support from the political left, from the political centre-right. It is garnering support from people who aren't...
So why doesn't Nigel Farage then?
But you need to address that question to him.
Well, he's your leader.
But Andrew, there's no point in hiding it. There are differences of opinion. He is in favour of signing up to go. I'm in favour of Vote Leave. And there's a strategic difference as well. I think we need to win this referendum with an unrelentingly upbeat, optimistic, positive campaign. I'm primarily interested in winning the referendum, not in mobilising the base.
Your leader says you're irrelevant. Should you not resign the whip and be an independent MP?
As I said, I've stood for Parliament 5 times. I've won 4 times. And it's the voters who decide who is and who isn't relevant.
All right. Mr. Carswell, thank you for joining us. And if you want more facts and figures about the EU referendum, and who doesn't, you can visit the reality check section of the BBC News website. It's excellent.